All right, so this is, once again, Notes Towards a Metapoetics of Paranarratology 1, a 17-part reading, elaboration, and/or interpretation of David Antin's Varieties, Rhetorical Deception in Narrative and Non-Narrative Storytelling. And this is, once again, Part 12, Danger, Deception, Delusion, Dramatikos, eironicus, Dramatikos, anagnoreikos, Daulis toward Delphi, and Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy. And we have been adding in America to clarify that that destruction of democracy is currently being engaged in America by the former ex-president and current fascist Donald Trump. And where we are in our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of Oedipus, and perhaps I should say where we are in our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristotle's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Aristophanes' reading, elaboration, and interpretation of the story of Oedipus in his comic play, The Smile of the Sphinx. And the reason that I didn't say it that way initially in articulating where we are in our reading, elaboration, and interpretation of David Antin's discourse is because I don't know certainly that David Antin is familiar with Aristotle's take on Aristophanes' The Smile of the Sphinx that's presented in the second part of his Poetics, which is, of course, the part that deals with comedy. And I am aware, that David is familiar with Aristotle's take on Sophocles' version of the story of the Sphinx. And I know this because when I was taking classes at UCSD in the 1980s and the early 1990s, I think the first 2 years, or perhaps the first year only of the 1990s. I believe the first 2 years, David Antin, used to assign the Aristotle, and when he taught Greek tragedy, within the art department at UCSD, that we would read Sophocles and also Euripides, alongside. I think if I recall correctly, the Euripides that was assigned was the Bacchae, and I think David used to assign the Bacchae to kind of problematize and make the relationship between Greek tragedy and what was presented in the Aristotle a bit problematic. And of course he could have made it even, he could have made the Poetics even more problematic if he had included, the comedy section that Aristotle writes. And then if he had noted, for example, which we've talked about, he doesn't note, but if he had noted that the Smile of the Sphinx, seems to have this subtle articulation of the formal structure for each one of the characters that involves a movement through anothisi and analipsi and anavasi, and that's completely neglected. If you've read the second part of the Poetics, you'll be aware that that formal structure that for me at least is so clearly evident in the presentation of and so clearly evident in fact that I over reified it in articulating the structure of the plot of The Smile of the Sphinx, and had to dig out my copy of that play in order to clarify and to correct, to provide an errata in which, I corrected, what I had initially remembered as there being a kind of one-to-one correspondence between the acts and the characters, the main characters that we identify with, who we identify with in this particular telling, and the corresponding themes within those acts that I had remembered, correspond to the othisi, analepsy, and anavasi for each one of the characters. As the play unfolds, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, Act 4, Act 1 belonging to Tiresias, Act 2 belonging to Laius, Act 3 to the Sphinx, and Act 4 to Oedipus. And I had misremembered that there are, in fact, those othisi, analepsy, and anavasi, but they're not presented in a sequential and linear correspondent, sequence, that is, Act 1, 1, 2, 3, Act 2, 1, 2, 3, Act 3, 1, 2, 3, etc. And then, that led, to further, discussion on the way that, narrative itself is always already a reification, and why that's important, and what it has to do, with the overall discussion of narrative as it pertains to varieties of rhetorical deception, and as we are constructing it here in relationship to this notion of metapoetics of paranarratology, which I don't believe we've ever actually defined, but we don't have we don't have time to define today, and where we are, this was all leading up to where we are, and where we are, of course, is within David's account and retelling and interpretation of Aristophanes, the Smile of the Sphinx. We are in Act 1, Scene 2, and we are just approaching Tiresias' account of his deceptive account of his third dream to the character, Laius, and we've described this at, design that is important to the way that this aspect of the story is represented, and the way that the deception, within this rhetoric on the part of Tiresias is represented in the set design and the dream within the dream and all of that. And so where we are is at the outset of David's discussion of this narration of Tiresias' third dream, which of course is not the way that David says he, but we've been correcting David and saying the way they actually experienced it, at least insofar as if we trust, right? If we trust Act 1, Scene 1, and the narration of the three dreams that are presented in Act 1, Scene 1, and we've talked about how Aristophanes, as a character, doesn't appear on the stage and say, ha, fooled you, that dream that we represented in this comedy, isn't really the way that it happened. And so there's a certain amount of good faith that we have, in the way that the unfolding takes place. And just like in cinema, kind of like if you get there first, you win the Aletheia Award, which means the following. Okay, so anything presented initially, right, we take as truth, and then what follows, if there's a discrepancy between what initially appeared and what appears later, there are a few exceptions, and Rashomon, is the Kurosawa comes to mind as clearly an exception to this idea, in which the narration of the entire, right, the entirety of the story within the story in Rashomon, right, is called into question by the testimony of these various characters, who were witness to a part of an event, but perhaps not the entirety of the event. And interestingly, there's a crime that's been committed, and interestingly, each one of the characters takes responsibility for the crime, right? Rather than denying that they're the culprit or the criminal who committed the crime. And the audience, we as an audience, and have to decide, in relationship to these various stories, what is true, and who is lying, and why. Perhaps we speculate why someone might want to lie about committing a crime, and what that means in terms of the psychology of the witness and the psychology of the testimony. So that's clearly an exception. But outside of that, in theater and in cinema, largely, whatever you experience first, whatever's presented first, the viewing subject, the audience, will take as the truth. And then if there's a contradiction that occurs later, aspects of that contradiction will be recognized as a deception. Now, you can always intervene in that and say, we fooled you initially. That wasn't the real dream. Here's the real dream. And you can go back and you can rewind, in a certain sense, metaphorical rewind, and you can say, okay, so what the narrative apparatus, recounted, for you, in whatever material way that it recounted it, was in fact a rhetorical deception, and the creation of a domain of rhetorical deception. And then that domain, can have all different kinds of functions and values, and it can exist in this, Donald Trumpy way where it's, insidious and malignant and just, trying to take power, or it can exist in the way that it exists in Kathy Acker's, fictive relationship to Herbert Marcuse, as a kind of discourse and a way of talking about transgression, and a way of operating through the muse of transgression, when the muse of the muse of transgression, who we've been referring to as Parabasia or Parabasisia, but who, that muse, seems to have been destroyed or defeated or relegated to the past, in some profound way, by a theory, or an idea, or a conceptualization, or a combination of all of those things, such as was presented in Herbert Marcuse's idea, right? And we'll pause here and wait for it. Because we seem to run up to it speedily. And that running up to it speedily, suggested that a pause was required as we, crossed the finish line. And here it is, Herbert Marcuse's idea of repressive, desublimation, right? Okay, so, and we've talked about other, deceptive domains that involve illusion and storytelling, as banal or as significant, right, as a mother's, storytelling to her children, and or as or as a storytelling of oneself that maintains certain fictions because perhaps there's a nostalgia surrounding those fictions, in addition to the psychological gratifications that these fictions provide, both elements of the libido and elements of one's understanding of oneself from the point of view of ego or superego. All right, so all of that, and I want to be somewhat speedy today, but I would still like to finish recounting David Antin's recounting of this third dream, as it's recounted by Tiresias to Laius at the conclusion of scene 2 in Act 1, and then at that point, then we can perhaps move on to scene 3 in Act 1, and David's recounting of scene 3, Act 1, scene 3. And the reason that I want to rush through this today and hope that I won't leave too much out is I promised my juggling instructor that I would practice my site swap notation, and I'm kind of eager to get to that. So in order, to perform that practice, and it was a promise, and I hate to promise anything, I'm not a Mennonite, but ancestrally, I guess, if that makes any sense, because it's not a very, it's not a very, historically lengthy, ancestry. It's not an ancestry that goes back very far. It can't, since this particular Anabaptism was invented, I believe in the 1600s, but it's relatively shallow ancestry. But it's, I guess, if one wanted to call it an ancestry, that my ancestry belongs to this Anabaptism that very specifically, right, defines the refusal, right, the refusal to swear oaths, and there, these oaths that they refuse to swear are largely oaths of allegiance to kings and countries and things like this, but if one wanted to expand it conceptually, promising something is a very risky business, because of the accidents and the contingencies, and the vicissitudes of our complex relationships to events and phenomena, and events and phenomenon, aren't just ideas that inform the structure of plots and whatever one wanted to call it, myth, fabula, in the building of story, but occurrences and events and incidents and the relationship of all of these, to as cause and effect, of other incidents and events and occurrences in our lives. Also, in addition, to informing our understanding of story and perhaps narrative, if one wants to include them in that, inform the course and shape and paths and segues and even digressions that our lives take, and so making promises is always a risky business, whether one has Mennonite a shallow Mennonite ancestry or not, and mine is even more shallow, because I was never confirmed that practice and that faith and that community is something that I rejected early on for a number of reasons, and so I was never anabaptized into it, but I still I still hold certain kinds of understandings of that bear upon in various ways, perhaps aspects of the philosophical and ethical dimensions of such a community's understanding of what it is to swear oaths and make promises. And I'm always very wary of making promises that I can't keep. And I made one this morning, and as I said, I made it to my juggling instructor, or my juggling mentor is perhaps a better word. And I promised them that, as I said, I would diligently practice my site swap notation. The quantum mechanics of juggling, and I don't want to break that promise, and therefore we'll try to proceed quickly through this final dream as it's deceptively, right, narrated to Laius. All right, so that having been said, let's return to David Antin's account of the dream, and David says that we're situated in the audience and we're watching this unfold on the stage, and as you'll recall, there's an apparatus that allows for a stage within the stage to emerge from beneath the stage, and it does so once again in order to initiate and inaugurate the experience of the third dream. All right, so the stage within the stage rises up, and it's the same, it has the same sort of background with the moving screens. The depiction of the landscape in the background, can move, these curtains or whatever you would like to call them, paintings, painted backdrops. Can be put into motion and create the illusion, right, of a shifting landscape. And then if one of the characters pretends to be walking or driving in a chariot, then we understand that we're within the representation of movement within that, in motion within that landscape. All right, so same backdrops on both sides of this split stage within the larger split stage that represents that rhetorical domain in which Tiresias is narrating this dream to King Laius, and then David describes who appears on this stage within the stage that emerges from below as a representation of this third dream, and he points out that as Tiresias is narrating all of this, and let's not bother with the pronouns. They are iterated in the narration, by another Tiresias, who again appears in the dream stage within the larger stage. And so that creates a comic effect, and there's laughter once again, and then he also points out that rather than there being a single Laius on the stage within the stage in the third dream, there are in fact three Laiuses, and that's. And that's somewhat interesting. And one of the Laiuses is crawling on all fours, and another of the Laiuses, these are the Laiuses within the dream, and another Laius is standing on two legs, and the third Laius is holding a walking stick, just like the walking stick that is being held by, both the Tiresias within the dream and the Tiresias outside the dream. And because now there are two Tiresiases, one outside the dream and one within the dream, David begins, utilizing the pronoun they when he, that is David, refers to either one or the other of the Tiresiases. We've talked about the phenomenological and cognitive rationale for that, and how it appears to be a kind of error in judgment in terms of recognizing the ontological status of the characters in number, but it's interesting, and we're not going to get too much further into that right here. Okay, so in any case, once the stage completely reaches its its destination, which is at a height slightly higher than the stage that forms the periphery, which represents the meeting between Tiresias and Laius. Then the two Tiresiases stop their synchronous narration, and and the Tiresias within, the central stage that represents the dream stage continues the narration. And as I said, David, points out, I don't think we really need to, but he points out for a naive audience, why it might be that that one of the Tiresias is crawling around on four legs, and one of the and in doing so, in a way, even for a naive audience, this is a kind of spoiler. So David is performing a kind of spoiler for the unfolding of the plot, right? When he describes why it is that one of the Laiuses is crawling around on all fours. One of the Laiuses is standing, and one of the Laiuses is holding a walking stick. And of course, the Laius outside of the dream, continues to sit on his throne, fascinated with the story that's unfolding of the dream. In this case, the third dream. And as as the Tiresias within the dream is narrating, the action, and narrating it, to the three, initially, narrating it, to the three Laiuses, the Laius crawling around on all fours, the Laius, standing on two legs, and the Laius, holding the cane. Then he says in this third dream, he says it wasn't you, who had the encounter with the stranger, who would become king, and in becoming king, who would destroy our kingdom. He said, but it was three of your servants. It was three of your servants sent to dispatch, this bringer of doom and destruction and death and horror. And just as, just as David's, well, not really just as David says, but just as David says, rather, just as, Tiresias reveals this, then they, and the they here, refers to, when David says they here, he's not referring to Tiresias, he's referring to the three Laiuses, and they are they because there are three Laiuses. He says then, they all, rip off, their masks, and their costumes, that, through which they convey this impression, that they are, three versions of Laius, one crawling around on all fours, one standing, upright, and one supporting himself. Of course, he says himself because he's referring to Laius, and that's absolutely correct. And one supporting himself, with his cane, and they rip off their masks and they rip off their garments, and they reveal, that they are in fact, three servants of Laius, sent on this mission to dispatch, the stranger, that is arriving to destroy, not only, to kill the king, but to take the kingdom and bring about, the plague. And just at at that moment, that they take off their masks, and shed their robes and reveal that they are assassins or servants or soldiers or whatever it is that whoever it is, whatever status they have in relationship to this mission. At that same moment, then Tiresias, the Tiresias within the dream, once again, rips off their mask and sheds their clothes, and we won't get into the pronouns and which one David utilizes. I imagine it's hard for me to remember at every moment of recounting his narrative, but I imagine that he uses he, if you're really keeping, detailed account of the sort of, the micro rhetoric of the engagement. But in any case, they rip off their mask and their clothes, and they reveal that that this actor reveals that, and it would probably be a he. This actor, the actual actor in Aristophanes' time, would probably be a he, and we can infer that from the social political context, and what it meant, to be a Greek citizen and a Greek artisan in Aristophanes' time, but if this were being performed in a contemporary circumstance, the actor or actress playing the part of Tiresias could easily be a he or a she or a they, right? And so whoever it is that's playing the role of the they, rip off, we'll just say they rip off their mask and reveal themselves to be the he, that is Oedipus. All right, so on the one side of the stage now you have an actor, and whoever, whatever gender they might be, they're playing the part of Oedipus, and on the other side of the stage you have these actors, who were playing the part of Laius, and now are playing the part of three servants of Laius, dispatched to kill this stranger who happens to be Oedipus, and so there's a struggle, and we don't need a narrator. David once again points out at this point, because we're familiar with this dance, and we know that this dance that they perform in all of these shapes and forms, right, that they entangle themselves. And it's even more interesting dance now, because the dance was already interesting, when it was between two characters, whether the characters were snakes or humans. And now, the dance is even more interesting, because you have Oedipus dancing, with these these three dancing servants of Laius, and they can create more complex forms and ideas and signs and glyphs and semaphores than even the initial groups of two could, and so this also gets a big rise out of the audience and much applause, David points out, and then at the end of the dance, the three servants of Laius, the three actors, playing the part of the servants of Laius, defeat Oedipus, and at that point, Tiresias, the Tiresias, who still exists outside of the frame of the dream, begins narrating once again, and they narrate that the dream also told them that in order to survive and return to Thebes, that they needed to survive the encounter with the Sphinx. And as Tiresias is narrating this deceptive part of the dream, and we're simplifying that it's the deceptive part of the dream, but this isn't the dream that that they actually had, David says. And that's what makes it a form of deception, and and who, Tiresias is deceiving, with this dream is, of course, Laius. And as Tiresias is narrating this part, of their dream, then the backdrop on the side of the stage, in the center of that stage within the stage that represents the dream, the backdrop on that side, and David says, I should probably go back and specify the three servants of the king, return to the king's side of the stage, and so they're separated, from the other side, and they begin walking or pretending to walk. Right? It's an illusion of walking. They're pretending to step, but they're not really going anywhere on this stage, and the backdrop, on both sides is unfolding, so that you can perceive that they're in motion, right? And when they reach this point, this imaginary point, that is created as a destination, right? The illusion, right, of the movement, toward this destination created by the backdrop of the stage, once the movement of the stage, the movement of the backdrop stops, we understand that they've reached their destination. At that point, David says, then the figure, in the center part of the stage in this third dream, who had initially been playing, Tiresias as the double narrator, and then, who took off their mask and their clothes, and revealed that, they were, in this aspect of the representation, playing the part of Oedipus, and then were killed, and had, spent this time that it took the backdrop to unfold to its destination, right? Then at that, had been playing, the dead Oedipus. Now the dead Oedipus rises, and this actor who's playing the part of the dead Oedipus, takes that mask off, and takes off, the garments, that the dead Oedipus and in fact the live Oedipus also, had been wearing, and reveals that whoever it is, whether it's a he or a she or a they, the actor playing this part, now represents the Sphinx, right? And so the dead Oedipus rises and becomes the Sphinx, and then the three assassins, the three servants of Laius, are now encountering. This is within the dream. David says, reminds us that we're still in the dream that Tiresias is narrating, and we now realize that they're returning to Thebes, and that they're encountering the Sphinx, and that their survival depends upon whether they can answer these riddles. And so this character in the center stage within the dream that Tiresias is narrating, and this part David says is kind of curious because Tiresias asks the questions. Tiresias asked the question. Tiresias from outside of the dream, from the stage that represents the encounter with Laius and the retelling of these dream narratives, but in deceptive form, like in sync with the questions asked by this actor playing the part of the Sphinx. Also asked the questions, also asked the riddles. And David says that's strange, because they're not, the same character. And but whatever that means, David says, and perhaps Perhaps this synchrony, requires interpretation, and perhaps, perhaps there was a section, in which Diarmenia, discusses this synchrony, and perhaps that was lost to us. And I think, and then stepping out of David's character for a second, I think he's being tongue-in-cheek and and somewhat ironic, when he's saying this, or playful, and perhaps doesn't really mean it. But I think this is again like playing out like one of these rhetorical deceptions, like coyingly saying maybe if Diarmenia were there, and there was a scene in which she could explain the synchrony to us, that it would make sense. And of course it makes more sense to us than it makes to David, because we understand that the relationship between Tiresias and the Sphinx embodies in multiple ways aspects of the seers and the various sacred one's relationship to the holy feminine or the sacred feminine, and that the relationship between the Sphinx and Tiresias is complex, both as guardians of Thebes and as counterparts in the development of this formal theme of Othisi and Ellipsi and Avasi. And David doesn't have access to that for whatever reason, and it doesn't exist in the Aristotle, whether David read the Aristotle or not. And I think by this expression I'm remembering that we're close to the end, so I'm gonna go back so that we don't get that blue screen. And yeah, we're back. All right, so Tiresias is narrating over, right, the character that plays the Sphinx inside the dream, and they ask each one of the servants of the king, a riddle, and that determines the fate of the servants of the king. So the first servant, receives the ordinary riddle, the one that's familiar to all of us. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 legs in the evening, and David, and once again tongue-in-cheek or tongue-in-cheekly, David says, and maybe because he was just playing the part, of Laius. Maybe because he was just playing the part of Laius, who was divided into 3 and walking around on 4 legs, 2 legs, and 3 legs. The first actor, the first servant playing the part of the first servant of the king, gets the answer right and says, a human being, and explains why, right? And that's that whole crawls as a baby, walks as an adult. Or not even as an adult, crawls as a baby, when it reaches a level of maturation in which, the child is no longer altricial, then walks on 2 legs, learns to walk on 2 legs, even before adulthood, and then, in later adulthood, perhaps, when the body begins to go, then, a walking stick is required, just as, Tiresias has the walking stick, and therefore, the 3 legs, right? It's not a sexual reference. Dave says it's not a sexual reference, and he smiles. He's not smiling here, so we're a little bit out of sync. All right, so the first servant of the king, gets to survive, and then so the Sphinx asks another question, and to the second servant or the second assassin, she is a she asks, okay, so if you guys are so smart, then what has 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs in the afternoon, and no legs in the evening? And the second servant or assassin says, a king, and of course, and then at the moment when David says, at the moment when the second servant says a king, then Laius, on that side of the stage that doesn't represent the dream, laughs out loud. And of course, he's sitting down, right? And the idea is that a king, right, just like an ordinary human being, crawls around, as a toddler, as a baby, as before reaching that stage of learning and development in which the child, learns to walk on two legs, just like any ordinary child. A king does this, and just like any ordinary adult, the king walks, with two legs, in our early childhood, through healthy adulthood. But if the king manages to lose mobility, in late adulthood, the king has servants and assistants, that can put him on a little carriage and carry him around and take care of all of his needs, just like King Charles, can't throw away his trash on his own, but he calls for a servant. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this story, but David says, in 2022, Queen Elizabeth, Queen of England, will finally die. At that point, no one thought that she was ever going to die, that she would live forever, and that there would never be a new ruler of England, because of the eternity of this queen with this incredible longevity. But finally she passes, and King Charles, it was touch and go for a while, because everybody thought King Charles might die before she did, but he didn't, and he gains the throne and gains the crown. And it turns out that this guy, and then throws his arms out like this. It turns out that this guy never even learned to throw away his own trash. There's stories about how somebody would accidentally fall in the trash, and he would call his servants, right? He would call his servants to take this thing out of the trash, even though they were in the courtyard, which in this setting it's a long way away, and it maybe takes him 5 minutes to get there, and all he has to do is bend over and pick this little piece of paper out of the trash. But he can't do it because he never learned how to do it, right? He never learned. He wasn't like Oedipus, who had to defend himself against all these bullies because he was a clubfoot, right? And learn to be strong and take on kings and assassins on the road, on the Tripleus and Moxitoius, on the fork in the road at Daulis toward Delphi. And in any case, this king, Charles, who eventually becomes king, and like I said, David says, sometime in 2022, but prior, he says, sometime in 2022, but prior to Donald's December declaration toward the destruction of democracy in America, and can't even take a piece of trash out of the waste paper basket, right by his side. Turns out that he's kind of grumpy because he really never learned how to do anything, and maybe he isn't going to make such a great king. But just like that, right? The king, he doesn't really have to do anything for himself. He doesn't have to use a stick. He doesn't have to use a cane to walk around. He just gets somebody to carry him, just like Charles. All right, so that's the answer to the second one, and then the second servant of Laius manages to survive, and he can go back home to Thebes. And then the Sphinx at that point, David says, all right then, what has four legs in the morning? What has four legs in the morning? 3 legs in the afternoon, and 2 legs in the evening. And the second servant, or the second assassin of Laius, says, a king, who lives the second part of his life in reverse, right? Because you'll recall that the answer for the king in the second riddle, the riddle itself was 4 legs, 2 legs, 0 legs, and I guess the third servant isn't very smart, because what has 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs in the afternoon, and 2 legs in the evening isn't even a king, who lives the second part of his life in reverse. That would be, I guess, that would be 4 legs in the morning, 0 legs in the afternoon, and 2 legs in the evening. And so even conceptually, like if we were thinking about it as not we talked about the syllogismos and how the idea of syllogism, and logic, that Aristotle is so fond of, plays, such an important part of the revealing, the anagnoreikos and the peripeteia in Sophocles, and how all of that is like played with and undermined in Aristophanes. And we talked about syllogisms a lot, David says. And here, like, everything's a little bit, out of whack, as it is in any good comedy, right? And so he's hinting at something that's really important in the Aristophanes, although he doesn't like name it explicitly. But he's hinting at this relationship in plot that plot has, right, to this the syllogismos, the syllogism, right, and to logic. And to how things are revealed, and to the way that that appeals, right, to the mind, and to problem-solving abilities, and all of this, and how playfulness in discombobulating all of that also appeals, like, to the problem-solving abilities of the mind, and how that's part of the playfulness and the mental activity that belong, to comedy under the muse of Thalia, and he's hinting at all of this. And he says, so not only, does this character not very smart, and doesn't have the right premises, but doesn't even get the logical form of the argument, right? So it's unsound, and the premises are off, and the Sphinx says, sorry, too bad, that's not right. And then she, of course, dispatches him. She murders that assistant to the king, and it's only the other two, that managed to make it, home to Thebes, and then at that point, Laius, outside the dream, says, "Wait a minute, so what is?" So what is the answer to that particular riddle? That riddle, what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs in the afternoon, and 2 legs in the evening, and then simultaneously, Tiresias outside the dream and the Sphinx inside the dream utter the same line, and of course this gets a big laugh. A dog twice run over by the chariot of a king, and that gets a huge laugh from the audience. And then at that point, the 2 remaining servants of the king, the 2 remaining assassins, you can see that they're walking. They bow to the Sphinx, and I guess they're not too worried about their companion. There seems to be no malice, right? I guess it's understood that it's part of her job, and you can tell by the unfolding of the backdrop that they're on the march again. They're on the road, and then they return to Laius. And at this point, these characters that are inside the dream address the Laius that's outside the dream directly, and they inform Laius, the real Laius, who's not, a part of the dream, but as if he were a part of the dream, that they've done the work, that they were asked to perform, and they've successfully killed the stranger, and they explain, how they survived, the encounter with the Sphinx, and they relate the story, to the king, and once again, relate all of the answers, to the riddles, and then at that point, they step back a bit, so that they won't be hurt. The actors, won't be hurt when the stage, descends, because they're leaning over and they're talking to Laius, who's in this other stage space, right? But then they step back a bit, and then the stage lowers, and the Tiresias outside the dream begins narrating the story of the dream, their story of the dream, their deception, right? Their misrepresentation of the dream that they actually had, and as they're doing so, then the stage, once again raises, and now the chorus again, in the shape of in the shape of the broken Ouroboros, but which now closes and becomes symbolic. David doesn't say this. I think because David isn't aware that it's supposed to represent an Ouroboros, but he does say that the circle closes before the chorus begins moving as a kind of round dance in this circular motion, right? So rather than being this open circle that speaks to the audience in the form of a classic parabasis, then now it's the moving circle of the chorus, the demos, that is speaking to the audience, and what we've implied, outside of David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of this element of the dream in this moment, as it's being told by Tiresias to Laius, is that the closed circle is supposed to represent the closing of the Ouroboros and and the healing, right, of the community, and in fact now each one of the members of the chorus, as they represent the demos, they look pretty good, they're healthy, and they reveal, to the audience in the parabasis that the cause of the plague, is now has now been eliminated. Of course, and what we understand is that this representation is in fact a misrepresentation and a form of rhetorical deception, because that is not in fact what was represented in the third dream. But in any case, its point is to appeal to Laius, and then as the circle is completed and the 360 degrees, we recognize the first character that presents a story in this particular parabasis, and the story of the health and of the community and the demos of Thebes, then returns to that place in the stage that occupies the closest position to the audience. Then at that point, then the stories have concluded and the stage lowers once again. The Tiresias, outside the dream, says, and those were the three dreams, and those were the three meanings, and you will understand the right course of action from the obvious interpretation. And he doesn't mention well, it's a kind of pun, right? When he says interpretation, and the obvious interpretation, which belongs to the three dreams, it's the same, Greek root, diarmene, that belongs to the name of his wife, Diarmenia. And then at that point, Diarmenia, who has been, in the audience somewhere, David says, cries out, and it varies. David says, so directors, very, very, what it is, and apparently, Aristophanes, has given some leeway, but sometimes it's be like, don't believe everything you hear, or sometimes at that point, she'll say, I don't think the interpretation is at all obvious, and whatever it is, it gets a laugh, and the relationship between this word interpretation and its function as the name of a character also gets played out in various ways. David says in right all of the dimensions of the rhetorical domains of deception and clarification that belong to the scene, and he says, and that's essentially like what we have in Act 1. And with that, and in hopes, right? In hopes that that I can do as promised, and practice, some of my side swap notation. We'll terminate, or we'll end. I just didn't say terminate. We'll end this discussion, for today, and then return to David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Act 2. Act 1, Scene 3. This is the conclusion of Act 1, Scene 2. But when we return, we'll return to David's reading, elaboration, and interpretation of Act 1, Scene 3 of Aristophanes, the Smile of the Sphinx.